Mr. President, I rise this morning to discuss what happened at the end of the debate in the House of Representatives on Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about the sweeping new authorities that were slipped into the legislation at that time by the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Then, Mr. President, I intend to respond to each of the major arguments that have been given over the last couple of days in an attempt to justify these expanded authorities in that provision that was added at the last moment and why they do not hold water. Now, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee called this amendment, expanding all these surveillance authorities, he called it merely technical. I want to explain why it's not just technical and how it passed the House with virtually no debate. And Mr. President, as I believe you and I have talked about, this has never been considered, repeat, never been considered here in the United States Senate. But members of the Senate are now being told the same thing that came up in the House. Nothing to see here. It's technical, and it's all classified, so stop asking questions. Now, I have spoken to a number of colleagues here, and I've urged them to just read the plain language of the provision. When they do so, they will see for themselves that this is actually a very substantial and dangerous expansion of warrantless surveillance authorities. Under the provision, there would be virtually no limits to who can be forced into spying for the government. Any company that installs, maintains, or repairs Wi-Fi or other communication systems in any American business or home, for example, can be dragged into this. So can any other company that provides a service that gives its employees access to any communications equipment, which would include a server, a wire, a cable box, a Wi-Fi router, a phone, or a computer. Lots of examples here, Mr. President. Every office building in America has data cables running through it. Tens of thousands of commercial establishments offer Wi-Fi to their customers. Under this provision, landlords, the companies that maintain the cables and Wi-Fi, and any number of companies whose employees have access to any of that equipment can all be forced to cooperate with the government's surveillance. Now, my view is there have been some pretty far-fetched and misleading efforts to justify what the House of Representatives did at the last minute. So I'm going to address each of the major arguments that I have heard in support of the House's dangerous expansion of surveillance authorities. First, supporters of this provision just wave away the actual language of the position and simply insist that no terrible thing is going to happen. But nobody who's ever tried to explain why the plain language of this provision wouldn't authorize the government to force a huge number of ordinary Americans and American companies to spy for the government has ever explained how what I have described as the plain language of the provision is not the case. Second, the administration says it's going after a narrower set of companies, but by the way, we're not going to hear anything about it because it's all secret. That's not how laws, especially surveillance authorities, ought to be written. I'm a member of the Intelligence Committee, and I'm familiar with these issues. The sky is not falling. If the government has a narrower intent, Congress can take the time to consider whether legislation is needed to actually address it. But jamming through a last-minute provision that dramatically expands surveillance authorities in a way that would affect so many Americans is just not right. I think it's irresponsible. And I think we ought to think through the implications. And anybody who thinks the government won't eventually use its authorities to the greatest extent possible, maybe they've been asleep for the last 20 years, but it's certainly a fact. Third, supporters of this provision spend a lot of time pointing to the exceptions. But the handful of narrow exceptions, Mr. President, makes my point. It proves my point. If you're not on that short list, In effect, it's an admission you can be forced to spy for the government. And the exceptions are clearly designed so as not to restrain the vast new authorities in any meaningful way. They're not even designed to work. For example, the exceptions do not include commercial landlords or any company that installs, maintains, or repairs Wi-Fi or communications cables. So even if the government can't force a coffee shop to comply, it can force its landlord or the company that maintains the coffee shop's Wi-Fi to comply. Supporters of the provision number 4 have said over and over again that Section 702 only targets foreigners overseas. This is a red herring. The provision does not change the targeting rules, but it dramatically changes who can be forced to actually help the government. And you don't have to change the targeting rules to threaten Americans' privacy. If the government thinks that its foreign targets are communicating with people in the United States, they can go right to the source: the Wi-Fi, the phone lines, the servers that transmit or store those communications. In my view, Mr. President, that is a stunning example of the government's ability to collect American communications and no changes in targeting authority. Finally, this brings me to a letter sent yesterday by the Department of Justice, which the chairman of the Intelligence Committee placed in the record. I urge my colleagues to read that carefully. It goes on and on about how the bill doesn't change the fact that only foreigners overseas can be targeted. The surest sign that you're losing an argument is when you try to change the subject. And that's what supporters of this provision in the Department of Justice are doing. The Department of Justice letter does not deny that the provision authorizes the government to force a broad set of Americans and American companies to assist with warrantless surveillance under Section 702. In fact, the Department of Justice basically concedes that fact by promising that it will only apply the new authorities to certain companies on a secret list. The Department of Justice is in the "don't worry anybody" department. They're basically saying we won't ever use these sweeping authorities you're handing to us. That commitment, in my view, Mr. President, is worth nothing. It's not even binding on this administration. It certainly wouldn't be binding on future administrations. These FISA authorities, like all FISA authorities, are going to get used to their maximum extent. You can bet on it. The same members of Congress who are touting the supposed act of restraint from the administration are going to be the first to demand that the government do more with these authorities. Now, secret promises are not law. I mean, that's just an obvious fact. And giving the government vast new power on the premise that intelligence agencies are not going to use it is just out of sync with history. One other point about the Department of Justice letter. The Department of Justice has promised to tell Congress what is going on every 6 months. Not only is that inadequate, it would be a violation of the government's statutory obligation to keep the Congress fully and currently informed of intelligence activities. If they only update Congress every 6 months on something like this, they are basically thumbing their nose at the whole idea of congressional oversight. This provision is fundamentally damaging to democracy. Americans should not be forced to spy for the government without a warrant. Ordinary businesses, big and small, should not be made extensions of government surveillance in a way that's going to put their relationship with their customers at risk. We've actually heard from a variety of companies who are concerned about just that, their customers being concerned about their privacy being invaded as a result of this and companies being hurt. Americans shouldn't have to worry about whether the companies that service their workplaces, the establishments they frequent, or even their homes are secretly spying for the government. My view is this is a breathtaking change, Mr. President, that was added at the last minute by the House of Representatives expanding surveillance authorities. Until a week ago, there was a debate about reforms of Section 702. And I would say, having been involved in a number of these debates, it's appropriate to have views of differing opinion on what reforms are necessary. But at least everybody was talking about the abuses of Section 702 and how to fix them. Now, All of a sudden, the Senate is being asked to dramatically expand the authorities of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in a way that is almost guaranteed to result in abuses. And my own view is that it is shocking that with no publication, no hearings, no processing of a piece of legislation in a single week to think about it, that the Senate is being asked to give the government sweeping new authorities that could fundamentally change the relationship in this country between Americans and their government. If the Senate passes this legislation today, my own view is, Mr. President, the senators are going to regret it. And when the eventual wave of abuses is exposed, nobody is going to be able to say now, given the fact we're airing specific responses to what the government said in the attempt to justify it, nobody is now going to be able to say they didn't see it coming. There are a number of us on both sides of the aisle who are pursuing an amendment to strike this dangerous provision. I'm pushing very hard to remove this provision. It ought to just be struck. It's called Section 25, the House bill, and we're pushing very hard to see that is accomplished. Mr. President, I yield the floor.